You never hear the shot that kills you. That's a myth civilians love. The truth is, you hear everything. The crack of the sonic boom, the wet thud of impact, the sound of your own breath hitching. I heard it all when the team pulled out. They left the wrong person behind. And now, I had 40 miles of hostile jungle to prove it. The rotor wash had flattened the elephant grass, but the stalks were already springing back, erasing the LZ like a closing wound. I checked my watch. 0400 hours. The extraction window hadn't just closed. It had been slammed shut by a decision made in an air-conditioned room 3,000 miles away. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, pressurized, like the air inside a sealed casket. I touched the transmit key on my radio. Static. Not the fuzzy static of interference, but the flat, dead hiss of a channel that no longer existed. I recited the line from the mission brief, the text that was supposed to apply to the VIP we failed to secure. No one came back for her. I tasted copper and red dust on my tongue, but a flicker of doubt pierced the clarity. I just never thought I'd be the one fulfilling the prophecy. I didn't scream. Screaming burns calories I couldn't afford to waste. Instead, I ran the diagnostic. It's a habit you don't break, even when the world ends. I checked the carbine first. Eject mag. Check brass. Reseat. Pull. I did it 3 times. The triple check ritual. 2 magazines left. 1 for the sidearm. A half-liter of water that tasted like iodine. Then I pulled the encrypted tablet from my vest. It was supposed to show the extraction grid, a blue line towards safety. Instead, the screen flashed a harsh red color, denying access with the message device unauthorized. My biometrics hadn't changed. My security clearance hadn't expired. This was a manual override. Someone at command had typed a specific sequence to scrub my transponder code while I was still breathing. It wasn't a glitch. It was an audit. I was no longer an asset. I was a liability on a balance sheet that needed balancing before the fiscal quarter closed. I cut the wire to the emergency strobe on my shoulder. Darkness was safer than a distress signal that no one was looking for. I retreated to the tree line, moving only when the low rumble of thunder masked the sound of my boots sinking into the mud. I found a hollow beneath the roots of a strangler fig. It wasn't a fortress, but it was dry enough to pull out the logbook. It was a small, battered thing, water-stained and smelling of old mildew and propellant. The pages were filled with coordinates and observations from 3 different continents, a paper trail of places I wasn't supposed to be. I clicked my pen. The sound was absurdly loud in the humid air. Under the header, Mission Day 14, I wrote the timestamp, 04:15. Then I wrote, Status, disavowed. Resources, 15%. Threat, unknown. I stared at the ink. It looked too neat for a death sentence. There was no anger yet. Anger is a secondary emotion, a luxury for people with full stomachs and full magazines. I just felt a cold, professional clarity. They thought this was a clean break, a simple deletion of a corrupted file. They forgot that data doesn't just disappear. It leaves a ghost image. And I was the ghost. The jungle doesn't care about your clearance level or your service record. It only cares if you are predator or prey. For the first 20 minutes, the noises were standard. The chirp of insects, the drip of water on broad leaves, the distant call of a tree frog. Then the rhythm changed. The insect stopped, cut off mid-chirp. A bird took flight 100 yards to the east, squawking a frantic alarm. Something was moving through the brush. It wasn't a patrol. Patrols are noisy. They break branches and curse the thorns. This was fluid. Heavy, but careful. I killed the backlight on my watch. I gripped the rifle, feeling the cold polymer bite into my palm as I pressed my back against the wet bark. My thumb found the selector switch. Click. Single fire. I didn't have the ammo for suppression. The wind shifted, carrying a scent that cut through the ozone and the rot. It smelled like heated oil and burnt plastic. Not animal. A machine. Heated oil. Burnt plastic. The scent of pursuit. I held my breath, listening to the dead air on the comms, waiting for the silence to break. 3,000 miles away. TOC. 0300. Coldwell. The air inside the Tactical Operations Center was maintained at a precise, sterile, 68 degrees. It didn't smell of ozone or rotting vegetation. It smelled of recycled oxygen and fresh laser printer toner. Admiral Coldwell stood before the main wall of screens, his reflection ghostly against the map of the sector. He wasn't looking at the terrain. He was looking at the metrics. The red icon representing Eve Harper had vanished, replaced by a neutral grey marker. Coldwell took a sip of lukewarm coffee from a ceramic mug that bore the unit's crest. He checked the time on the wall clock, synchronized to Zulu, and then glanced at the fiscal calendar pinned to his corkboard. The Senate Oversight Committee audit was scheduled for Tuesday. A failed extraction with a living witness was a messy narrative. A casualty due to hostile environment was a tragedy, but it was a tragedy that fit neatly into a spreadsheet cell status, Coldwell said. His voice was calm, the voice of a man managing a portfolio, not a war. The feed is severed. Admiral, a technician reported, typing rapidly. Transponder is dark. We have total signal decoupling, Coldwell nodded. Satisfied? Log it. Comms failure, followed by loss of contact. Keep the timeline clean. Colonel Rook didn't turn away from the screen as quickly as the Admiral. He was staring at the grey marker, his knuckles white as he gripped the back of his chair. He could still hear the static in his headset, the phantom echo of a channel he had been ordered to cut. We had fuel, Rook said, his voice low. We had a 12-minute window. We could have pulled her out. He wasn't arguing. He was stating facts that no longer mattered, like reading a weather report for yesterday. Before Coldwell could answer, Maya Chen stepped out of the shadows of the legal alcove. She held a tablet like a shield, her face illuminated by the harsh blue light of the display. She didn't look at the map. She looked at the audit trail. Fuel isn't the issue, Colonel Maya said, her tone crisp, risking her clearance. The issue is the biometric handshake. The system didn't terminate the connection automatically. It was a manual override. Command code authorization. She tapped the glass screen with a manicured fingernail. That creates a timestamp. If this goes to discovery, a manual override looks like intent. It looks like we scrubbed the asset to avoid a quarantine breach, she added. That's not just a mission failure. That's legal exposure. Coldwell turned slowly, his eyes narrowing not with anger, but with calculation. He walked over to Maya. Looking at the data stream, she was highlighting, exposure can be managed. Ms. Chen, if the asset doesn't return to contest the log, the manual override is just a glitch. An anomaly in a high-stress environment, he dismissed the human cost with a wave of his hand, focusing entirely on the narrative architecture. Rook stepped in between them, the guilt finally finding a target. He looked at the Admiral, then at the lawyer. You're talking about her like she's a misfiled tax return. You think scrubbing the code ends it? Rook shook his head. a bitter laugh escaping his throat. You looked at her file, but you didn't read it. You saw the rank. You saw the pay grade. You didn't see the operator. Rook pointed at the silent, grey screen where Eve used to be. Eve Harper wrote the SERE manual, the survival manual you're trying to hide behind. She knows how the system eats its own. You think she's just going to die quietly because you turned off a light bulb? Rook lowered his voice. The weight of the mistake settling in the room, they left the wrong person behind. The silence in the room stretched, heavy and suffocating, contrasting with the hum of the server racks. Coldwell looked at Rook, then back at the map. The risk assessment had shifted. It was no longer about a lost asset. It was about a rogue element. A survivor who knew the protocols better than the people trying to erase her. Coldwell didn't panic. He simply adjusted the parameters of the problem. If she is as capable as you say. Colonel, then we can't rely on the jungle to do the work for us, Coldwell said. He walked back to his desk and picked up a secure phone. He didn't look at Rook. We need to ensure the narrative holds. If the asset is compromised, the asset must be sanitized. He looked at Maya. Draft the after-action report. Classify the loss as hostile action. Body not recoverable. Seal the file under the National Security Act. Maya hesitated for a fraction of a second, a glitch in her own programming, before nodding. I'll need a witness signature for the chain of custody, she said. Coldwell held out the phone to Rook. The Colonel will sign. It's his operation. He waited. The receiver, hovering in the air like a loaded weapon. Initiate the cleanup protocol. Coldwell ordered into the line, and send the machine to verify. The wind didn't just howl. It whistled. A thin, high-pitched scream tearing through the gaps in the corrugated steel fencing like a kettle boiling over. I crouched in the long shadow of a deflated fuel bladder, tasting the air. It was heavy, saturated with red dust that coated my tongue with the metallic tang of old copper and battery acid. I checked my watch, forcing my eyes to focus on the glowing digits. Hour 01. The first hour is always the filter. It separates the casualties from the tactical problems. I pulled the logbook from my vest, the paper damp with sweat and the humidity rising from the jungle floor. My hand didn't shake. Tremors are a waste of energy, but the pen dragged heavily on the swollen page. I wrote the timestamp, 0500. Then I added a single, clinical line, perimeter porous. No visual on hostiles. Status, denial. I wasn't just recording history. I was forcing my brain to process raw data instead of sliding into panic. A loose sheet of tin rattled against a fence post, rhythmic and annoying, like a nervous finger tapping a desk. Above it, a rusted yellow placard flapped violently in the wind. A rusted sign warning of foreign object debris that could wreck an engine. Foreign object, debris. Anything that didn't belong on the flight line. Anything that could wreck a delicate engine. That's exactly what I was now. I wasn't a soldier anymore. I was debris that could damage the machinery if I wasn't swept up and incinerated. The first probe came from the north sector, near the skeletal remains of the maintenance sheds. It wasn't an attack. It was a question asked in the language of violence. A snap of dry wood, too deliberate to be a wandering animal, too loud to be a rookie mistake. They were testing the perimeter, trying to trigger a panic response fire. If I engaged, I gave away my position, my weapon type, and my desperate lack of numbers. If I stayed silent, they would assume the garrison was empty and close the net. I had to lie. I looked around the dirt and spotted a length of steel conduit, heavy and rusted red. I weighed it in my hand, calculating the arc. I waited for the wind to gust again, for the whistle to reach its peak volume. When the noise was loud enough to mask my exertion, I hurled the pipe against the far wall of a corrugated hangar, 40 yards to my left. The crash was deafening. A sharp, metallic shriek that sounded enough like a bolt carrier slamming home to fool a nervous pointman. I didn't wait to see the reaction. I moved. I sprinted low through the drainage ditch, counting my steps in the mud. 1, 2, 3. Slide. The return noise came seconds later, a shifting of weight in the brush near the hangar. They had turned toward the sound. They bought the lie. I held my position in the drainage culvert, feeling the warm, stagnant water seeping into my boots. The threat was adapting faster than I liked. They didn't rush the hangar with guns blazing. They spread out. I could feel the vibration of their movement through the ground more than I could actually hear it. Heavy boots. Disciplined spacing. No shouting. This wasn't a clearance patrol looking for stragglers. It was a siege designed to suffocate. They weren't sure what was inside the wire, and that caution was my only shield. My decoy had bought me space, but it also sold them a different story, that the garrison wasn't empty. That was the core doctrine of the Phantom Garrison. Make one rifle sound like a fire team. Make silence feel like an ambush waiting to spring. But the adrenaline was burning off, leaving a cold, dull ache in my joints and a hollowness in my stomach. I watched the shadows lengthen as the sun tried to break through the canopy. They were changing rhythm now. Stop. Listen. Move. They were counting the heartbeats in the silence. I realized the grim math they were doing. They weren't afraid of me. They were afraid of the unknown variable. They were estimating a squad strength of 4 to 6 men. I was winning the psychological war, but I was losing the clock. I crawled backward, inch by agonizing inch, until my back pressed against the concrete footing of a radio tower. I needed to breathe, but the air felt too thick to swallow, saturated with heat and the smell of rot. I reached for the radio on my chest, purely out of muscle memory, a reflex drilled into me for a decade. The channel was supposed to be dead. It was dead. Just a flat, empty hiss of white noise. Then it broke. Not with a voice, but with a sound that froze the blood in my veins. Snap. A mic keying open. I stopped breathing. Silence. Then another snap. It was rhythmic, deliberate. It wasn't interference. Someone was on the secure frequency. I stared at the handset. The black plastic slick with mud. They weren't hailing me. They were breathing. I could hear the faint, wet intake of air, synchronized perfectly with my own chest rising and falling. It stopped when I held my breath. It started when I exhaled. A cold shiver went down my spine, sharper than the tropical heat. They weren't just looking for me on the ground. They were listening to me on the one channel that was supposed to be erased. They were inside the loop, and they knew I was alone. I didn't bother turning the radio off. I stripped the battery pack from the casing and let the unit drop into the mud. The wet, synchronized breathing cut off instantly, but the silence didn't return. It was replaced by a high, thin whine in my left ear tinnitus, the body's internal alarm system screaming when the mind refuses to process the impossible. They knew I was alone. The logic of the Phantom Garrison had collapsed. Now, the open ground was just a killing field waiting for a ballistic solution. I moved toward the concrete footing of the maintenance bunker, my hands finding the recessed handle of the service hatch. It was rusted shut, welded by years of neglect and tropical oxidation. I didn't have a pry bar. I used the stock of my rifle, hammering the latch until the corrosion gave way with a groan of tearing metal. I slipped inside, feet first, dropping into the dark throat of the garrison. The air changed instantly. The humidity of the jungle vanished, replaced by the dry, stale scent of dead rats and copper wire. I pulled the hatch closed above me, sealing myself in a steel coffin to escape the sharks circling outside. The tinnitus didn't stop. It just got louder in the dark, a constant reminder that the clock was ticking faster than my heart. The service corridor was built for high-voltage cables and hydraulic lines, not for a human being in tactical armor. The space compressed around me, forcing me into a crouch, then a crawl. The ceiling was a maze of conduits that snagged on my vest, scraping against the ceramic plates like fingernails on a chalkboard. Every yard forward was a negotiation with friction. My left shoulder, the one that had taken the brunt of the extraction fall, began to throb. It wasn't just pain. It was a structural failure. A sharp, hot spike radiated down to my elbow every time I put weight on my hand. I stopped to breathe, but the air was thin here, recycled too many times. I reached for the hydration tube on my shoulder, biting down on the valve. Nothing came out but a warm sputter of air and a single drop of plastic-tasting water. Dry. I spat the valve out. My mouth felt like it was packed with cotton. The dizziness hit me then, a sudden tilt of the world that had nothing to do with the uneven floor. Dehydration was setting in, thickening my blood, making every pump of my heart a labor. My body was a depletion engine, burning fuel it didn't have. I forced myself to keep moving, counting the rivets on the floor plating to keep my focus. 1, 2, 3. Drag. 1, 2, 3. Drag. Then the vibration in the floor stopped. The heavy, rhythmic thud of boots on the surface had vanished. A rookie would have celebrated the silence. A rookie would have thought they had lost the trail. I knew better. Professionals don't lose a trail. They adjust the geometry of the hunt. They knew I was in the tunnels. They knew where the exits were. The hunters weren't chasing me because they didn't have to. They were herding me. I froze as a sound echoed down the length of the corridor, amplified by the steel walls. It was distinct, sharp, and mechanical. The metallic click of a latch engaging. It came from ahead of me. Then another click, fainter, from behind. They weren't breaching the tunnels. They were locking the access points. They were turning the bottleneck into a pressure cooker. The tactic had shifted. They weren't trying to shoot me. They were trying to contain me, to seal the system so they could apply a different kind of solution, a solution that didn't require line of sight. The realization didn't bring panic. Panic is for people who think they have options. I didn't have options. I had a trajectory. The tunnel only went one way deeper toward the central plant. I checked my sidearm. 1 magazine. I checked my light. The beam was yellowing, the batteries fading to a sickly amber. I killed the light. Darkness was better than a dying sun. The tinnitus was a roar now, drowning out the scuff of my own boots. I pressed my ear against the cold steel of the wall, listening for the next move. It wasn't a voice. It wasn't a footstep. It was a hiss, faint at first, like a tire leaking air, then growing steady. It was coming from the vents overhead. They weren't waiting for me to starve. They were flushing the system. I didn't know if it was tear gas, smoke, or something that would burn the lungs out of my chest, but I knew I couldn't stay here. The bottleneck had snapped shut. I had to find the drain. I started crawling faster, ignoring the fire in my shoulder, moving toward the only thing that mattered, the sound of running water deep below the concrete. The drain pipes spat me out into a hardened alcove that smelled of diesel fumes and ancient grease. I didn't stand up. I couldn't. My left leg had decided to resign from the war, cramping into a knot of useless muscle that forced me to drag myself across the concrete like a crippled animal. Above me, a rusted steel plate was bolted to the wall, stenciled with faded black warnings. A line of text warning of the jet blast area faded on concrete. I stared at the words, the irony landing softly in the silence. There were no jets here anymore, just the ghost of thrust, and the reality of abandonment. I propped myself against the cold wall, my breath coming in shallow, ragged hitches. The sprint through the tunnels had burned through my adrenaline reserves, leaving behind a hollow, shaking weakness. My mouth was dry, parched enough that my tongue felt like a strip of Velcro against the roof of my mouth. I tried to swallow, but there was no moisture left to give. I checked my watch, counting the seconds for the backlight to fade. 0300 hours. The night was dragging its heels, refusing to end. I wasn't fighting a squad anymore. I was fighting the clock, and the clock was winning. Survival isn't about bravery, it's about inventory. I pulled the magazine from my carbine, my fingers numb and clumsy. I didn't just look at the brass. I counted it, touching each round like a rosary bead. 1, 2, 3, 17 rounds. 17 chances to say no. I reseated the mag and moved to the next item. The flashlight beam was a sickly yellow, flickering with every movement. Battery life, less than 10%. I twisted the cap, turning it off to save the dying photons for a moment that mattered. Then I reached for the hydration bladder. Flat. Empty. I squeezed the reservoir, hoping for a miracle drop, but got nothing but the taste of warm plastic. That was the third strike. No water. Low ammo. Dying light. My body was becoming a depletion engine, burning fuel it didn't have. I started counting my heartbeats, pressing 2 fingers against the carotid artery. It was too fast. Fluttery. My body was trying to compensate for the blood loss by pumping sludge faster through the pipes. I closed my eyes and forced the countdown. 120. 115. If I didn't slow the engine, I'd burn out the bearings before sunrise. I tried to shift my weight to ease the pressure on my hip, but the tactical vest refused to move with me. It felt glued to my left side. I reached inside the armhole, my fingers brushing against the fabric of my undershirt. It was wet, but sticky, tacky. The blood from the shoulder wound had dried into a paste, bonding the cotton to the skin and the ceramic plate. Every breath pulled at the scab. Every twist tore it open again. I gritted my teeth, refusing to make a sound. Pain is just data. It tells you the machine is damaged, not that it's broken. I looked at the sign displaying the words, Jet Blast again. I held my post. That was the phrase they taught you in basic. You hold the line until relieved. But there was no relief coming. Holding the post now just meant dying in a designated zone so the paperwork would be tidy. I wasn't going to be a statue in a memorial garden. The loyalty that had kept me on that landing zone was a currency that had been devalued to 0. I wasn't a soldier holding a post. I was a squatter in a tomb, waiting for the landlord to come and evict me with a flamethrower. The fever hit me 20 minutes later. It wasn't a slow creep. It was a sudden wave of cold that made my teeth chatter, rattling in my skull like dice in a cup. My body was diverting heat to the core, shutting down the extremities to keep the vital organs online. My hands were ice cold, stiffening around the pistol grip. I knew what this meant. The wound wasn't clean. The jungle had gotten inside. Infection moves faster in the tropics, turning a scratch into gangrene in the span of a patrol. I looked at the dark opening of the tunnel I had just exited. The silence was heavy, but it wasn't empty. They were still out there, sealing the exits, waiting for the sun to come up so they could sweep the complex without night vision. I couldn't wait for morning. If I stayed here until dawn, I wouldn't be able to stand up. I checked the time again. 03:45. I had maybe an hour of mobility left before the fever cooked my brain or the blood loss dropped my pressure below the wake-up threshold. I had to move now, while the pain was still sharp enough to keep me awake. I lost 30 minutes. When I came back, the air changed. The transition from the jungle was marked by the violent assault of climate control. The air inside the server farm didn't just feel cold. It felt sterile, scrubbed to a mathematical constant of 68 degrees. I leaned heavily against a row of humming server racks, my boots leaving dark, wet prints on the anti-static tiles. Outside, silence was a predator. Here, it was a machine idling. The room vibrated with a low, fluorescent hum, a headache synchronized with the flickering lights overhead. I smelled industrial carpet and the sharp chemical tang of printer ozone, the scent of briefing rooms and court-martials. It was the smell of bureaucracy. I checked the corridor through the narrow glass pane. Empty. The records division night shift was a skeleton crew. I wasn't supposed to be here. According to the board in the Tactical Operations Center, I was already dead, a body not recoverable. But ghosts don't leave mud on the floor. I dragged my left leg forward, the muscle spasming, and moved toward the main terminal. It sat on a clean desk, guarded by an ergonomic chair that looked like it had never supported the weight of a crisis. I didn't hack the terminal. I didn't have the tools. Instead, I used credentials memorized 3 years ago, the admin override for the Sector 4 logistics hub. A back door left open for contractors. The screen flared to life. Blue light harsh against my dilated pupils. My fingers smeared dried blood on the keyboard as I typed. I didn't search for my name that triggers flags. I searched for the extraction chopper, Bird 40. Data spooled out in green columns. My eyes scanned the screen quickly through the columns of green. Fuel load, 85%. Payload, empty. Flight path, aborted. No enemy fire. The telemetry showed a steady hover for 4 minutes before the tether was cut. I drilled for the authorization code. Every command has a digital fingerprint. I expected a generic code protecting the brass. I didn't expect a specific user ID attached to the abort order. Auth. Archer_V. My breath hitched. Not just a code. A call sign. Archer. The man who taught me to tie a tourniquet with my teeth. The man who called the service a family favor. He wasn't just in the room. He was the one who pushed the button. You can't be in here. The voice was thin, trembling. I spun around, tearing a line of pain through my shoulder. A young corporal stood in the doorway, clutching files like a blast shield. He saw a monster dredged from the swamp. Caked in mud and dried blood, I was a living violation of his clean world. He reached for the phone, hand shaking. I have to call security. You're listed as deceased, ma'am. Don't, I said. Not a shout. A fact. I stepped into the light, revealing the rank tab on my ruined vest. Pick up that phone, Corporal, and you become part of the chain of custody, a witness to a resurrection they tried to cancel. He froze. He was terrified, not of the gun, but of the paperwork, of the anomaly. I need you to authenticate this audio file, I said, pointing to the screen. You have the encryption key. Use it. I can't, he whispered. That's classified. The Admiral. The Admiral isn't here. I cut in, my voice scraping like gravel. I am, and the system is lying to both of us. Open the file, Corporal, or explain to the board why you let a ghost access the terminal. He looked at the phone, then at me. He saw the authority. He moved slowly, stepping around me, and keyed in his sequence. Access granted. The audio file was a snippet of the command channel scrubbed from the main server. Static, hissed through the speakers. Then a voice cut through. Clear, calm, Archer. Status of the asset? A second voice. Asset is secure at the perimeter. Waiting for extraction. Fuel is green. A silence that lasted a lifetime. I watched the waveform, the heartbeat of the betrayal. Negative, Archer said. The narrative requires a casualty. If she comes back, the timeline collapses. We need the legend, not the liability. Sir? She's on the line. Cut it. Scrub the transponder. Initiate the depletion protocol. The recording crackled. Then Archer's voice returned, softer, carrying the cold calculus of overhead. They left the wrong person behind. The corporal gasped, stepping back. He understood. It wasn't a tactical decision. It was murder. I watched the file end. The final tag wasn't an order. It was the automated readout of the mission status changing from active to terminated, speaking the same line I had recited in the mud. No one came back for her. I pulled the drive. The corporal pressed against the wall, making himself small. He knew the truth now. The system hadn't just failed. It had fed, and I was the bones sticking in its throat. The processing center didn't smell like a hospital. Hospitals smell like bleach and hope. This place smelled like menthol rubbed over decaying latex and the sharp antiseptic sting of rubbing alcohol hitting an open abrasion. I sat on the edge of the examination table, the paper crinkling loudly with every shift of my weight. They had taken the mud-caked armor, the vest with the dried blood, and the boots that still held the red dust of the extraction zone. In their place, I wore paper-thin blue scrubs that offered no warmth and even less protection. The room was a box of aggressive sterility, lit by overhead fluorescent tubes that buzzed with the sound of a trapped insect. The light didn't just illuminate, it vibrated, a low-frequency hum that burrowed into the base of my skull, synchronizing with the throbbing headache behind my eyes. I kept my hands folded in my lap, feeling the ghost of the rifle's pistol grip in my palm. This wasn't a medical triage. If it were, they would be treating the infection in my shoulder or the dehydration cramping my muscles. Instead, they were watching. A camera in the corner blinked a slow, rhythmic red eye. This was a filter. They were sifting the debris of the mission to see what could be salvaged and what needed to be incinerated. The evaluator entered 3 minutes later. He didn't introduce himself. He wore a white coat that was too clean, holding a tablet with the same casual indifference a waiter holds a menu. He didn't look at my wounds. He looked at my eyes, searching for the telltale shimmer of instability. "Standard post-deployment screening," he said, his voice flat. "Do you know where you are, Specialist?" "Garrison intake." I lied. I knew exactly where I was. I was in the psych hold annex, the place where liabilities are parked until the paperwork catches up. "Do you feel oriented? Any loss of time? Hallucinations?" I paused, calculating the answer. If I appeared too competent, I was a threat, a rogue agent who had survived the purge. If I appeared too broken, I was a medical discharge. I needed to be the latter. I needed to be the dull, rusted tool that wasn't worth the effort of repairing. "I see things," I said softly, letting my gaze drift to the floor. "Shadows. In the trees." He tapped the screen. "And the mission parameters? Do you feel you executed your duties?" "I don't remember the parameters," I said. "I just remember the noise." He stopped typing. He looked at me, really looked at me, and I saw the clinical detachment slip for a second. He wasn't buying the act. Or maybe he saw something else. "You're exhibiting signs of target fixation," he murmured, more to the file than to me, focusing on the threat to the exclusion of the environment, to the exclusion of orders. It was a trap. He wanted me to defend myself, to snap back with a tactical justification. I swallowed the urge to correct him. I swallowed the pride. I just nodded, letting the label stick. "We retrieved your personnel jacket from the archives," he said, scrolling down. "Interesting history. Second generation. Your mentor Archer was section chief, wasn't he?" My blood ran cold. My mentor Archer had been a logistics officer, a desk jockey who died of a heart attack when I was 12. He wasn't section chief of anything. The evaluator turned the tablet around. "We found this in the supplementary file." It was a digital still, grainy but high resolution. It showed a briefing room, the same blue light, the same stale carpet. At the head of the table sat a man in a grey suit, looking at a map. It was Archer, older, greyer, but undeniably him. The timestamp in the corner was from 3 days ago. The world tilted on its axis. My private rule, the belief that I was a soldier doing a job for a faceless system, shattered. Archer wasn't dead. He was part of the architecture. The grief I had carried for 20 years, the reason I had enlisted, the reason he had taken me under his wing as a family favour, it was all a fabrication, a legend built to secure an asset. "Do you recognise this man?" the evaluator asked, his voice soft, predatory. My tongue went dry. I maintained the mask. I forced my face to remain slack, my eyes dull. Inside, I was screaming. The system hadn't just used me, it had bred me. "No," I whispered. "I don't know him." He watched me for a long moment, looking for the crack. When he didn't find it, he tapped the screen again. Pity. The file suggests a strong familial concordance for compliance. The door opened and 2 orderlies stepped in. They weren't medical staff. They moved with the heavy, balanced gait of military police. "Evaluation complete," the doctor said, standing up. "Transfer the subject to Ward 4. Compassionate watch. Ward 4. The oubliette. The hole where they put the ones who know too much but can't be killed quietly." As I slid off the table, my legs trembling from genuine exhaustion, I passed a gurney in the hallway. A man was strapped down, staring at the ceiling, mouthing words to an invisible audience. He locked eyes with me as I passed, his pupils blown wide. He didn't look crazy. He looked terrified. An older nurse was adjusting his restraints. She had grey hair pinned back in a severe bun, and her hands smelled of menthol and harsh soap. She didn't look at me, but as I was steered past her, she leaned in, adjusting a tray of instruments. Her lips barely moved, the sound dropping under the hum of the ventilation. I held my post. It wasn't a comfort. It was a code, a signal from the underground of the facility. I didn't stop. I didn't react. I let the orderlies push me toward the elevator, the words echoing in the antiseptic silence. I wasn't the only ghost in the machine. The concept of free movement is a civilian luxury. In the garrison, you are either an operator moving with purpose or an asset being moved with paperwork. I was the latter. The 2 orderlies flanking me didn't hold my arms. That would imply I was a physical threat worth restraining, but they occupied the space around me with a heavy, suffocating proximity. We moved down the transfer corridor, a long, windowless throat of the facility that smelled of stale bleach on breath and the ozone sting of floor buffers. Every time the orderly on my right shifted his grip on his belt, I heard the squeak of latex gloves rubbing against synthetic fabric. It was a wet, friction-heavy sound, intimate and gross, like a surgeon adjusting his tools before an incision. I kept my eyes forward, counting the ceiling tiles. 1, 2, broken. 1, 2, stained. It was a way to keep the mind from chewing on the panic. I wasn't being taken to a ward. I knew the layout of this complex better than the architects. Ward 4 was to the east, past the nurses' station. We were heading north, toward the freight elevators, toward the sub-basements where the ventilation hummed a darker, deeper note. This wasn't a medical transfer. This was an extraction. They were pulling the weed out by the root before the rot could spread to the rest of the garden. At the end of the corridor, the blast doors were guarded not by a keypad, but by a man, Major Mercer. I knew him by reputation, not by face. He was the type of officer who kept his boots polished to a mirror shine, even during monsoon season. A man who believed that order was a moral imperative, not just a logistical one. He stood with his arms crossed, blocking the path to the lift cluster. He didn't look happy. He looked like a man who had been handed a grenade with the pin pulled and told to hold it tight. "Stop," Mercer said. His voice was clipped, practiced. He held up a hand, palm flat. "I have no authorization for a transfer of this subject. The intake logs are sealed until 0800. The orderly on my right didn't flinch. He didn't even salute. He simply reached into the pocket of his scrubs and produced a folded sheet of yellow paper. It wasn't a standard digital pad. It was physical hard copy, the kind used for orders that aren't meant to leave a digital footprint. "Direct override, Major," the orderly said, his voice bored. "Signature authority is level 5. Mercer took the paper. I watched his eyes scan the header. I saw the micro-expression of recognition, followed instantly by the tightening of his jaw. It was the look of a man hitting a power wall. He knew the signature. It wasn't just a rank. It was a weight that could crush a career without leaving a bruise. He folded the paper slowly, handing it back with a stiffness that screamed resistance, but his feet moved. He stepped aside. He couldn't stop it. The chain of command is a gravity well. You don't fight it, you just fall. The elevator arrival was announced by a chime that was too cheerful, a bright synthetic ding that belonged in a department store, not a black site holding facility. The doors slid open with a heavy hydraulic groan, revealing a cage of brushed steel and scuffed rubber flooring. We stepped inside. The space was shared. In the corner, pushed against the bumper rail, was a metal cart loaded with medical waste bags of saline, bloody gauze, and Sharps containers. As the lift began its descent, the cart rattled over the seam lines of the floor, a rhythmic metallic clattering that sounded like teeth chattering in a skull. But it wasn't just waste on the cart. Behind it, seated in a wheelchair with secure restraints, was a figure draped in a heavy thermal blanket, a stasis subject. He was thin, his skin possessing the translucent, waxen quality of someone who hasn't seen the sun in years. His eyes were open, fixed on the middle distance, seeing things that weren't there. He was the leverage, a living reminder of what happens when the system decides you are broken but still useful. He was the ghost of Christmas future, wheeled out to show me the retirement plan. The descent felt endless, the air pressure building in my ears as we dropped past the basement levels and into the bedrock. The cheerful chime hadn't faded. It just hung in the air, a mockery of the grim silence. The orderly pressed the button for sub-level 3, the button that didn't have a label. I looked at the man in the wheelchair. He hadn't blinked. His hands, thin and brittle like dried twigs, were twitching against the leather straps. He wasn't crazy. I realized that with a sudden, cold clarity. He was processing. He was running a loop of data that had nowhere to go. As the elevator brakes hissed, slowing our fall, he turned his head slowly. The movement was mechanical, grinding. He looked straight at me, his eyes clearing for a fraction of a second, the fog lifting to reveal a terrifying, lucid intelligence. His lips parted. The skin cracked. He didn't speak to me. He spoke to the air between us, reciting a line that had been burned into his hard drive. I don't want a medal. The breath went out of me. It wasn't just a phrase. It was Archer's phrase. The words he had said in the kitchen when the notification letter came. The words I had carried as a shield against the cynicism of the job. Now, they were in the mouth of a broken asset in a freight elevator. The system hadn't just erased Archer. It had digested him, breaking his code down into sound bites for the inmates. I realized then that the transfer wasn't about moving me to a cell. It was about moving me into the archive. I was about to become just another line of dialogue in a ghost story. The inquiry room was a box of acoustic foam and brushed steel, buried 3 levels below the TOC. There were no windows, no phones, and no cellular signals. The silence here was thick, a physical weight that pressed against the eardrums, broken only by the dry scritch-scratch of Maya Chen's pen on fresh legal paper. The air smelled of new toner, and the sharp chemical scent of an unsealed ream of copy paper the perfume of an audit. Admiral Coldwell sat across the table, his uniform impeccable, his posture relaxed. He looked like a man expecting a commendation, or at least a standard debriefing. He didn't see the room for what it was. A kill box. Maya didn't look up. She turned a page of the binder, the sound loud in the dead air. She wasn't an operator. She was the immune system of the agency, and she had detected a pathogen. She lined up 3 documents on the table: the mission order, the extraction log, and the physical printout of the manual override code. She placed them with the precision of a blackjack dealer showing a winning hand. "The narrative is solid, Miss Chen," Coldwell said, his voice smooth, filling the silence. We lost an asset due to hostile environment variables. The extraction window closed. It's tragic, but the math holds. Maya stopped moving. She looked at him, her expression blank, professional. She tapped the second document with her pen. The math holds if you look at the digital log, she said, but the digital log was edited. Coldwell's smile didn't waver, but his eyes hardened. Logs are reconciled for accuracy. Post-mission. Standard procedure. Reconciliation changes a status, Maya corrected. It doesn't change a creation timestamp. She slid the third document across the metal table. It was the raw server dump from the archive, the one Eve had accessed in Scene 06. It showed the command sequence entering the system. The override code to scrub the transponder was entered at 0355, Maya said. The hostile contact report wasn't filed until 0410. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper that carried more threat than a scream. Read the times, then explain the gap. Coldwell looked at the paper. He didn't touch it. He knew that touching it was an admission. The gap was 15 minutes. 15 minutes where he had ordered a soldier erased before there was even a reason to leave her behind. It wasn't the fog of war. It was premeditation. The hum of the ventilation system seemed to drop an octave. Coldwell shifted, the leather of his chair creaking. He was boxing himself in. He couldn't claim a glitch because the code was his. He couldn't claim an emergency because the timeline proved the emergency hadn't happened yet. You're looking at raw data without context, Coldwell said, his tone shifting from managerial to command. We had intelligence of an imminent breach. I made a preemptive call to protect the network integrity. It was a strategic decision. It was a liquidation, Maya said. And you used a traceable login. She opened the final folder. It contained the transfer order for Ward 4, signed by Mercer under protest. You tried to bury the error in the psych ward, Maya continued. But you didn't account for the redundancy. The asset accessed the terminal. The asset has the audio file. And now, the asset is sitting in a transfer cell with a memory of the event that contradicts your report. Coldwell stood up, placing his hands on the table. I am the ranking officer here. My report is the official record. Anything else is just the rambling of a traumatized soldier. Not in Discovery, Maya said. In a Senate hearing, trauma looks like a cover-up. Maya closed the binder. The snap of the rings locking shut echoed like a gunshot. She wasn't saving Eve Harper because she cared about justice. She was doing it because the liability was too high. She looked up at Coldwell, seeing the sweat finally breaking on his forehead. He realized the walls had closed. He wasn't fighting a jungle. He was fighting a paper trail, and he was unarmed. I can't sanitize this, Maya said. The anomaly is in the backups. The override is in the server logs. The transfer order is in the physical intake. She stood up, gathering the files. She didn't offer him a way out. She offered him the reality of the blast radius. You have 2 hours before the Oversight Committee pulls the daily sync, she said. You can't erase the asset. You have to reinstate her, because right now she's the only thing keeping this from being a treason charge. She paused at the heavy steel door, looking back at the man who had tried to play God with a spreadsheet. If this log goes outside, the whole chain burns. The heavy steel door of the Office of Special Counsel clicked shut behind me, sealing the air-conditioned silence inside. The sound was final, like a vault locking. I stood in the administration corridor, the fluorescent lights reflecting off the polished linoleum floor. It didn't smell like the jungle, and it didn't smell like the antiseptic misery of the infirmary. It smelled of lemon floor wax and stagnation. I looked at the folder in my hand. It contained a single sheet of paper, a non-disclosure agreement, retroactive to the date of deployment, attached to a transfer order for the Quartermaster Corps in Nebraska. This was the deal Maya Chen had brokered. I wasn't dead. I wasn't erased. I was simply buried under a different kind of soil, compartmentalized, reassigned and silenced by the weight of a signature. I adjusted the strap of my bag on my left shoulder. The pain was still there, a dull phantom throb where the bullet had grazed the bone, but the wound was closed. The scar was just another line of data on a body that had become a liability log. I walked toward the exit, my boots squeaking faintly on the wax. Major Mercer was waiting by the security desk. He didn't look at me with the contempt he had shown in the transfer corridor. He looked tired. He held a small black velvet box in his hand. He didn't offer a handshake. He slid the box across the laminate counter toward me. "Distinguished service," Mercer said. His voice was hollow, reciting a script he didn't believe in. "For actions that are classified?" I looked at the box. I didn't open it. I knew what was inside. A piece of stamped metal and a ribbon, a receipt for a transaction where I had traded the truth for a pension. I reached out, my fingers brushing the velvet. It felt cold, heavy with an artificial gravity. It was the medal my mentor Archer never got. It was the medal the man in the stasis chair had rejected. If I took it, I accepted the narrative. I accepted that Archer was a hero who made a hard call, and I was just a lucky survivor. "Keep it," I said. Mercer blinked, his bureaucratic mask slipping. "It's on your record, Harper. You earned it." "My record is sealed," I said, "and I don't wear bribes." I pushed the box back. It slid across the counter with a soft hiss, stopping at the edge of his uniform. I pushed through the glass doors and into the parking lot. The heat hit me instantly, but it wasn't the wet, choking heat of the tropics. It was the dry, dusty heat of a garrison town. I walked to my car, an old sedan that sat baking in the sun. I felt lighter, but it wasn't a good feeling. It was the weightlessness of being unmoored. I had survived the jungle, the betrayal, and the audit, but I hadn't won. The system had adapted. It had absorbed the anomaly. I unlocked the car door. Then I locked it. Unlocked. Locked. Unlocked. I did it 3 times. The triple-check ritual. It wasn't about security anymore. It was about verifying that I still had control over the mechanism. I opened the door and sat in the driver's seat, the steering wheel burning my palms. I pulled a new, pristine logbook from the glove compartment. I clicked my pen and wrote the new reality into the log. Active. Compartmentalized. Threat. Internal. I wasn't a soldier anymore. I was a sleeper agent in my own life, waiting for the next error in the code. I started the engine, listening to the idle settle into a steady rhythm. I looked at the rearview mirror. The administration building loomed behind me, a grey monolith of concrete and glass. Somewhere inside, deep in the server farm, the audio file of my betrayal was archived, tagged and buried. Somewhere in Ward 4, a man was staring at a wall, holding onto a fragment of the truth. And somewhere in a corner office, Admiral Coldwell was looking at a spreadsheet that finally balanced. They wanted a legend. They wanted a ghost story they could control. They didn't get that. They got a witness who learned how to be quiet. I put the car in gear, but I didn't pull out yet. I looked at my hands on the wheel. They were scarred, shaking slightly, but they were mine. I hadn't let them rewrite the ending. I hadn't let them turn me into a tragedy or a hero. I was just the remainder, the one variable they couldn't zero out. I whispered the words to the empty car, not as a comfort, but as a testimony to the only thing that was still true. I held my post.